Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I hope you'll get something out of this talk. One of the things that I was asked to do while I was here was to talk about qualitative research. In other words, using data from things like interviews with people, observation, things like that. And so what I thought I'd do is talk about my work, particularly in what I'm going to call storytelling. Because what people do when you interview them, they tend to tell you stories. And I think the stories that people tell are really revealing about some of the aspects of the way they think about themselves and their wider life. I've been talking to quite a few people here over the last 2 or 3 weeks while I've been in Hong Kong. And one of the things that people say to me, both in business studies and in other disciplines, in other social science disciplines, is that they think it's harder to publish work that's qualitative in nature, and it's easier to publish in quantitative, statistical research and things. Well, I'm not sure that that's true. And one of the reasons for putting up all these pictures of these journals is that I don't think it's simply showing off, but I've published in all these journals, which are generally quite well regarded journals, and I've published qualitative research. So I don't think one should be worried about damaging your career by publishing qualitative work. The other thing I would say is that I was reading about the latest Nobel laureate in physics. I can't remember his name, but last night he was being interviewed and he said, if you want to do science, do it because you love it. Now, I think the same applies even to business studies. And if you love research, do what you love. If you happen to love qualitative research, then do it regardless, even if you find that it does slow your career down. You just got to do it because that's what you love. But as I say, I don't think, it's certainly not been my experience that it's held me back in career terms to do qualitative research. I have done some quantitative research, but my background is largely in the humanities, in things like literature and philosophy. So I haven't really got a full training in all these statistical techniques anyway. So I'm making the best of my training within a social science. Okay, so how do you publish storytelling work? Well, there's lots of ways, but I'm going to talk about 3 different approaches that I've taken over my career over the last sort of 20 years. One is to look at the stories that other people tell you when you're doing research interviews. So the work that I did around the turn of the century, which is 20 years ago now. It's scary how quickly time moves on when you're getting old. I interviewed a load of very senior people, and I asked them, what do you see as the heart of your job? And they told me all sorts of stories about their jobs. So I'm going to look at some of their stories and how you might want to, or my approach to interpreting these stories that they told. The other thing is I'm going to look at things from right the opposite dimension, rather than other people's stories that I've told myself. We all do that. I mean, every night when we get home, we think about the day, well, certainly I do, and we tell, in our inner monologue, we tell ourselves what's happened. We've told ourselves stories. And I think, I'll illustrate why I think this, that you can actually publish from the stories that you tell yourself. And then the other thing that I've done is I've looked at stories that occur in things like myths and in literature and popular culture. in particular Disney movies, Disney animations. And a lot of these stories are in pretty direct, surprisingly direct ways about work. And I think analysing these stories, things that you see in films and things, is another fertile way of using or of publishing qualitative research. Now, although I've made these three categories separate, I do think they're kind of overlapping. So the stories that other people tell get into the stories that you tell yourself, and vice versa. And the stories that you read in a novel or that you watch on a film don't come from nowhere. They're related to the stories that people tell to one another and the stories that you tell yourself, because you can't really talk about, you can't even have thoughts about what you've done today without relating it to what you know about the nature of the world and the stories that other people tell about these things. So that was me about 25 years ago. I don't think I've changed at all, have I? But in those days, actually it's probably nearer 30 than 25 thinking about it. But in those days I was a keen young manager. Maybe the kind of person that some of you will be once you've got your degree and you're out there in the world, you know, changing the world by dressing in a power suit and things like that. Men and women both do that. My first piece of research when I left being a manager and became an academic was interviewing chief executives. And it struck me that had my life been different, I could have been one of these chief executives. It's a kind of double, you know, that's haunting me, that maybe, going back to physics, you know, isn't there a theory that there's hundreds of different, well, an infinite number of different worlds out there. Every time we take a decision to go one way rather than another, there is a world where we took the decision to go the other way as well. So maybe out there somewhere, there's somebody like me being a chief executive somewhere. In fact, lots of chief executives are very much like me today. You know, they're middle-aged men, privileged men. And so I think everything I'm going to say about managers and business people in general, it may well be that I'm talking as much or perhaps more about myself than other people. Okay, now before we get into some of these stories, let me tell you what I take to be kind of theoretical thoughts about what storytelling is. So I've said we all tell one another stories, and we tell ourselves stories, even if there's nobody else there. And I think storytelling is unavoidable. Now, one of the things I'll be doing is telling you stories about stories. The Greek for that is meta-stories. And some of that may not look like a story. I mean, when you're a child, I guess this is probably similar in Hong Kong, but the way a children's story starts in English is once upon a time. Once upon a time there was a fairy princess or something like that. Do you have an equivalent in Cantonese? The children's stories start with a kind of formula. Maybe the kind of stories that you tell young children when they're going to sleep or something like that. Okay, so one of the points I want to make is that you can't tell a story without having at some level referenced earlier stories. All stories are retelling of all sorts of different stories that we've imbibed in the culture. And one of the, again, I think it's, is it Greek or Latin, this intertextuality. The idea that when I'm telling one story, what I'm doing, I can't start from a blank slate. I've always got other stories in my mind that influence the way that I'm telling my stories now. And that's an important point that I'll come back to as we look at some of these stories that I'll give you examples of. Another thing about stories is that although the story is ostensibly about something that's usually other than the person who's telling the story, the stories that people tell say as much about the teller as what the story is ostensibly about. If I tell you a story, you can start to infer things about me that if somebody else told a similar story, you would infer things about them. And the fourth point is that in the business world, storytelling is often used to exploit people or to control them. Not just in the business world, but in the wider, nasty world out there. If you just think about President Trump and some of the stories he tells to try and manipulate people or get people to do what he wants and so on. Or perhaps, to think about the stories and counter stories that are being told about the political situation in Hong Kong at the moment. That's another example. So there are lots of ways or lots of people who use stories that aren't necessarily that positive. But I think I want to encourage us to think about stories with what I've called this internal focus, helping us to be human, helping us to be better people in some way as we live our lives in the world. That's certainly my intent. So, I don't think it comes very naturally for us to want to use stories in these sort of instrumental ways. I don't think many children say that to their fathers as they're reading them a bedtime story. And sometimes we might want to ignore the fact that we're telling stories. But final bit on the theory side of storytelling. We might think that we're telling an original story, but we never are really. We're always basing our stories on what I've called social scripts. There's certain things that, if you think about, telling a story about a management situation, there's only certain stories we can possibly tell. There's limits to what we can say that is comprehensible. And the kind of stories that people tend to tell are institutionally approved narratives. In other words, they tend towards serving the interests of powerful people. What I want to do in the way that I kind of interpret stories is to show how you don't have to stick to these social scripts. Other scripts are available that challenge these sort of taken for granted institutional scripts. One of the things I'd like to do in this talk and in my research more generally is to, I've used this term here, shock us into reflexivity. What I mean by reflexivity is get us to think about our reactions to stories and get us to see them as problematic, as things that we might want to revise. Let me give you a few examples. Okay, and the final thing before I do give these examples, if you want to read some great books about storytelling in the setting of organisations, here are three that I'd recommend. David Boge's Storytelling Organisational Practices, Yanis Gabriel's Storytelling and Organisations, and Monica Costera, Organisations and Archetypes. I hope all those are in the library, but if not, I'm sure the library will get them for you. Okay. So, just before I get into some of the stories that I want to show you, let me just say that I've always been inspired by other people's stories. I like reading novels and I like watching films and I'm interested in myths and things like that. And so always, as you'll see, I try to make my influences explicit. Another thing is that I don't think that people intend some of the meanings of their stories that I'm going to suggest that these meanings have. But still, whether they intend them or not, I think these meanings are there. And if you want to get really theoretical about it, the approach I'm advocating is something that Matt Salverson and Dan Carriman call grounded fictionalism. But also, if you want to get much less pretentious about it, I like the word storytelling, because it suggests a sort of ambiguity. When I was a boy, and I wanted to cover up something that I didn't want my parents to know about, I tended not to be very good at it. And my mum would say, "Mark, don't tell stories." Because the idea of storytelling in English is sort of, it has a kind of double meaning, because it can suggest that you're lying. Don't tell stories, don't lie. But on the other hand, as I say, we all tell stories all the time. I mean, we can't say anything really without anything complex, without putting it in stories. So I think storytelling is nice for the kind of thing that I do, because it hints at what I've called this shadowy zone. Is it fact? Is it fiction? Is it myth? Is it truth? Well, it's possibly both, and rather than one or the other, we don't have necessarily to decide whether what I'm saying is fact or fiction, myth or truth. Could be both. Okay, so let me talk, first of all, this is where I want you to refer to your handout, about my first set of interviews. These are interviews with chief executives. And I think that when I did these interviews around the year 2000, I asked people, the first question I always asked them was, tell me about the heart of your job. And people tell me all these weird and wonderful stories. And the way I made sense of it was that I think that so many of the stories were kind of hero myths. I don't know whether you recognize this picture, but it's from a film called Jason and the Argonauts. Do you know the story of Jason and the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece? It's a Greek myth, first told probably about 1,000 years before Christ, something like that, about this, Jason, who has to go and get this golden fleece from this mythical land. And it's quite a hard thing for him to do. But he does it in the end. And there's lots of hero stories. A more modern one might be, say, something like James Bond. You've all seen James Bond films, I guess. Or you know what I mean, even if you haven't seen the films. And all these hero stories follow a kind of structure, a similar structure. So they start with the hero living in what one might call the civilized order of home. So James Bond is in his London office going to see M, and everything's fine. And then he has to fly off to somewhere like Jamaica, or I think he's been to Hong Kong a few times actually in some of the films. But anyway, somewhere exotic and different. And these heroes, whether we're talking about Jason and the Argonauts, James Bond, all sorts of different people, encounter lots of difficulties and opponents. They're often magical, or might appear to be quite magical. But in the end, he always wins, this hero. Now, let me tell you, let me read this first story out loud. So this is so I said, I always ask people what they see as the heart of your job. So this guy, one of these chief executives said, oh gosh, yes, well, of course I can. I suppose the three The three main elements to it, and I may add to this as I go along, but I think the first element is the kind of captain of the ship role, which is, I suppose, ultimately about trying to coordinate what's going on in the organisation at the top level, giving a sense of direction and making sure that we're moving in that direction. And it seems to me that's a role that nobody else can play. I don't see it as my role to necessarily determine the direction, because I do think in an organisation like this, it's very much a team matter. But there are occasions when I will stamp my view on what we'll do. And particularly where there isn't a great deal of room within the... So that's the first thing, captain of the ship. The second is managing the board, mainly the chairman of the board. And what I mean by that is that in the same way that I think I'm responsible for making sure that the organisation has a sense of direction with and is moving in that direction, then I have to try and make sure that the chairman of the board contributes to the same direction, but doesn't blow us off course. And that's quite a tricky role, making sure that they're involved constructively and feel involved and feel that they are shaping and influencing things. And again, there is nobody else but the chief executive can do that. The third thing, which I think is important in my role, and I know this sounds arrogant, but I don't feel like that, it's protecting the organisation and the people within it from this torrent of nonsense that pours out of Whitehall into Quarry House through regional office. Those last bits are just sort of parts of the hierarchy in which he was embedded. And so perhaps you can understand why I showed this picture of this ancient Greek ship. So Jason in Jason and the Argonauts was a captain of a ship, and he had to face, if you've seen the film, you'll know that he got attacked by gods who did things like pour out the torrent, not necessarily of nonsense, but of, they'd be throwing rocks at his ship or something like that. And he also got blown off course and things like that. So it seems to me that this chief executive was drawing on what is regarded in the West as a kind of archetypal hero myth to make sense of who he was. He was somebody like Jason and the Argonauts, or he was somebody like James Bond in the way that he thought of himself. Not that he goes around killing people, certainly not literally, but anyway, so that's the kind of way that I start to make sense of a story like that. And then one of the things that I say is that, yes, the civilized order of home. So you remember I said, it's not so much Jason and the Argonauts, but another famous Greek myth is the myth of Odysseus. And you remember he had his wife and his son. His wife was Penelope, and his son was... I'll have to it'll come back to me in a moment, but they're all famous characters. So it was a nice family, civilized place to live, was his island, and he had to leave it. And I think if you look at story 2, this is the story I told about finding these chief executives, these hospital chief executives, when I was doing my interviews. So I say, in searching large unfamiliar hospitals for the HQs, that's where these chief executives were, I regularly got lost, ending up somewhere like an outpatients department full of anxious patients queuing up for their appointments, or in an unsightly service corridor. On eventually arriving at the HQ, however, there was an obvious contrast. Here, calm and order reigned. Typically, the reception was occupied by a woman in a corporate environment. I did not have to queue, being the only person there. I was offered coffee, like this afternoon, and a chair. And as I waited there, there was generally a hush, punctuated by an occasional ringing telephone, or by a small group of people with tidy haircuts, smart suits, and polished shoes. Calm continued as I went with a well-presented, always female, personal assistant to the chief executive's office. The offices always had a feeling of spaciousness, accompanied by restrained opulence. Cluttered desks were rare. Indeed, most were noticeably free of anything except perhaps a copy of my letter. You can tell how long I did this. We still wrote letters in those days. Requesting the interview, a phone and a PC. Everyone conformed to the conventional Western executive dress code. Almost all exceptionally smart. Could have worn my tie and a jacket, and I would have been like that. They were gracious and helpful. The chief executives, along with the general appearance of the HQ, gave the impression of being profoundly ordered and civilized. Why? I asked myself. Well, one reason for this contrast between the rest of the hospital and the HQ is that it creates and sustains the first part of the hero myth, the existence of a civilized ideal, the part of the myth that is necessary for the arena of the heroic deeds, the wilderness, to be plausibly represented. Okay, so here we have this chief executive sitting in his office in this very civilized place, with the rest of the hospital being a kind of wild, unfamiliar place that all sorts of horrible and unimaginable things happen. So the next part of the story, when I was interviewing these people, they told me stories about things that encounters with these difficulties and opponents and magical things. There's lots of these stories. I'll just give you a taster. So one of them was talking about a difficulty he had. I had an issue here where we had no leadership in the intensive treatment unit, ITU. We had no clinical leadership in the ITU. We had people just doing sessions and nobody was going to agree about who could be the clinical leader. And I was told when I first arrived that this was unmanageable and untouchable. I just took the view that it was unacceptable not to have a clinical leader in such an important area. So I actually got a clinician from elsewhere. He is president of a learned body related to clinical discipline, who I know, to come and have a look and make some recommendations. And that stirred everybody up because they didn't like what he said. And also made the people who refused to make the decision rather embarrassed, because other clinicians from outside the anaesthetic fraternity were beginning to point the fingers, and suddenly they all wanted a leader. So the way that hero stories like this work is that you set up all sorts of difficulties, but the hero always triumphs. James Bond always meets some horrible bad guy who seems to be completely, far. They always live in some massive lair with millions of people surrounding them, but he always manages somehow to blow them all up and kill them. And it's the same in these stories that the chief executive told, it seemed to me, that they were telling stories that implied there were really, really difficult problems, but they always won. I remember when my son must have been about 5 or 6, and we were watching on TV a film called Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, another hero story, Robin Hood being the hero. I don't know whether you've seen it. But anyway, at the end, Robin Hood has this big fight, a sword fight with the Sheriff of Nottingham. It's a great film. But my son, being 5, he was sat on my knee and he was bouncing up and down because he was so excited. Because presumably he didn't know who was going to win. Was it Robin Hood or was it the Sheriff of Nottingham? Well, if he'd been older and seen all these films, that's the convention. But we know who's going to win. There's no way. It might look from time to time that the Sheriff of Nottingham is about to run him through with the sword. But we know, because we've seen these things hundreds of times, these sorts of things, that the hero is always going to win. And so it was in these stories that these chief executives told. The other thing is that there's something very kind of masculine about these stories. Now, I interviewed a lot of people, and most of them were men, but there were some women who told, well, there were some women who were chief executives who told interesting stories. We're on story 4. This is a woman who's a chief executive telling me her story. So she's saying, I think as managers, we're not good at making clear either our own personal values or organisational values, and we don't live them. And I suppose it comes back to some HR issues. People talk about, are we a learning organisation? We value our people, we invest in development. But where's the evidence of that within the organisation? Does the chief exec demonstrate it by sharing their learning? Do they show people that it's all right to go off and do different things in their own behaviour? Do they look at a payback for the organisation from training and development? How are all these things integrated? I think there are other things around family-friendly policies. What is the point in having a family-friendly policy which says to people you can work sensible hours when you've got a chief exec who insists on working 20 hours a day and insists that everybody else works the same around them? Again, it's around what's important, I suppose. There's an issue about demonstrating your own personal behaviour. It's as much as about how you treat people, how you talk to them. The faceless chief executive. Are you visible within the organisation? Are you seen to people? Do people understand your values? Are you explicit about them? Are you prepared to stand by them? I have young children and a husband. I don't want to spend 20 hours a day in whatever the place was. If I did that, I would be spending most of that time working at 50% capacity because I'd be knackered, I would rather spend a sensible amount of time at work, have some valuable quality time at home, and come back to work feeling rejuvenated and enjoy that. When I came to this place, there was a macho culture which was about kind of what presenteeism, as people call it. It's about being there, about kind of what, it's not doing anything, it's about being there. I had to quash all those things. I go around telling people to go home. If the ladies in the office are still here at 6 p.m, I'm the one who goes, what are you doing? Get yourself home. Have you taken off time in lieu? And just making sure. But a friend of mine is a secretary to a chief executive at another trust. And because he works, endless hours, he expects her to be there. He's paid 100,000 a year, and she's probably paid 20,000. Unfair, If he wants to do it, fine. But don't put that kind of pressure on other people. So I would be the first to acknowledge that the job is a bloody hard one. It's an incredible, complex agenda. So here's the talk of a female chief executive. And it's true to say, for example, that none of the men ever talked about their families. None of the men said, I've got 3 kids and a wife or something like that. A lot of them, incidentally, did have photos of people I took to be their kids on their office desk or something like that. But none of them mentioned them. So it was the women who mentioned their families. Most of the women did mention their families. But I think the trouble with this sort of story is that it illustrates the double bind that a lot of women are in these senior positions. Because they want to talk about that, they feel it's important to stress things that you can't imagine, or certainly none of the male chief executives said. So, for example, you might have noticed that she says that she's got a friend who's a secretary. I can't imagine, well, none of the male chief executives ever said that they had a friend who was a secretary. But it is interesting, because if you also look at what she says, she talks about the ladies in the office being here at 6 o'clock. Well, one wonders, who are these ladies in the office? I happen to know that at the time, not only her, but the director of finance and the medical director were both women. But I don't think she was including them in the ladies in the office. I don't know, but I can't imagine she's telling them to go home. I think she's talking about secretaries. The trouble is, she's very patronising. And there is rather an irony in talking about quashing a macho culture and things. And everything she says that links her to the conventionally feminine, things like, I want to spend time with my family and so on. She always seems to want to justify with, something instrumental and something that's something more conventionally about the job. So the way she doesn't want to spend time with her family simply for the sake of it, according to this story, but she wants to spend most of that time. She wants to spend time with her family because otherwise she'd be working at 50% and she'd be knackered. She wants to go back to her family so she feels rejuvenated and is a better boss. So one of the things I ended up saying about this sort of story is that it's because it's so important, and certainly it was 20 years ago, I suspect it still is, to present oneself in masculine terms, whether you're a man or a woman, as a senior person. What people like this seem to be doing is kind of walking a tightrope because they don't want to come across like a kind of virtual man. They want to have elements of femininity, but they need to correct themselves all the time and say, well, but that's okay because it makes me a better boss. And the kind of hero story that reminded me of, do you know about the Amazons in Greek myth? They were a tribe of female warriors. And they could give as good as they get to the male warriors, and usually beat them in battles and things. And what the Amazons did, one of the things they did was that they cut off their let me get this right. I think it was their left-hand breast, so that they could shoot arrows better, less painfully. Must have been painful to do that in the first place. But anyway, so what they were doing were compromising some of their more feminine characteristics so that they could compete in a kind of predominantly male world. And I think that's the kind of thing that this woman sadly was doing, I think, was that she was saying, yes, I am a woman, but I can survive in this heroic masculine world. So a lot of people, when they read that story, think, she's a great person. I'm more ambivalent about it, thanks to the kind of stories that, or the storytelling approach to the analysis that I bring. Okay, let's move on. But before I do, I'm going to have a glug of water. I'd be very happy to have any responses or thoughts or comments that you might have at this stage. But on the other hand, if you haven't got any, I'll press on. So that's examples of stories that people have told me. Now I want to move on to publishing qualitative work based on stories you tell to yourself. Here's, you know the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Very famous story written in the mid-1880s by a Scottish author called Robert Louis Stevenson. And you know the story, don't you? I imagine that Dr. Jekyll, the guy in the middle, Spencer Tracy as it happens, in a 1940 Hollywood version of this, he's a medical doctor and he's experimenting with various chemicals. And he manages to drink a potion that turns him into a different person. Somebody who looks completely different, Mr. Hyde, and acts completely different. It's all, the negative things inside him that come out. And so as far as people are concerned, and in his house there appear to be two men living there together. This Mr. Hyde and Dr. Jekyll. And we all know the story now, so it's not much of a shock. but the original readers of the novel were absolutely, it caused a sensation. The idea that two men were actually one man, or maybe it was the other way around. And the reason I use this story is really as a kind of inspiration to something about my own identity, which I've always found, I've always had ambivalence about. Because as somebody who became an academic somewhat late into my career, I passed my PhD when I was 41. I've had a completely different career before I was an academic. And there was a sense in which I left a management job, became an academic, to escape from all sorts of compromises that I've made as a manager. Some of the ones that that I felt uncomfortable about, the stories that chief executives were, being very careerist and having to tell people to do all sorts of things that I knew were in their best interest, but it was part of my job to do. So I thought that escaping, as it were, to an academic job where I was teaching and doing research would enable me to live a kind of pure life. So rather than being a kind of Mr. Hyde in my management job, I wanted to be this nice Dr. Jekyll in my academic job. But what I found, I think anyway, was as I became more established as an academic, I couldn't get rid of this Mr. Hyde. There was because I was still being very careerist. I was still doing all sorts of things that I was uncomfortable about, but was doing them anyway. Let me give you an example. Let's turn to story 5. I'll read you out the story Mark in Urbana-Champaign. I wrote this article with a colleague and a friend of mine, Mike Humphreys, who also tells his stories, but I won't bore you with both stories. So this is me going to an academic conference around 15 years ago. I love this conference. Such a change from your average management event. The first afternoon consisted of special workshops. I went to one on performance ethnography. During the session, we were split into groups and asked to prepare a performance on our first experience of racism. We decided to start by telling one another our own particular story. Fascinating experience, especially as the group was made up of people from all over the world. For instance, someone had grown up in a black township in 1960s South Africa. What, he wondered, was his first experience of racism. Another group member had spent her childhood in a privileged family in the southern states of America, waited on by African American servants. She too wondered about her first experience of racism. As for me, I contributed what I had to excavate from my subconscious, an almost forgotten memory of when I was about 14 years old. Needless to say, the session was more than merely interesting. It was also challenging and personally involving, and it set the tone for the rest of the conference. Many subsequent presentations, like this first session, explored the political through the personal. The focus was very much on autoethnography, what I'm doing now, and performance ethnography, though with room for more conventional papers like mine. And my most enduring memories are of the effective performances. I particularly remember the almost unbearable accounts of child prostitutes in South America. Reliving a father's funeral brought me close to tears. And hearing about someone else's adolescent angst helped me to understand a surprising amount about my own current relationships as an adult. There were very few articles on my putative interest, but then that hardly mattered because of the rich experiences many of the other presentations provided. In fact, it wasn't just the content, but the atmosphere and overall feel of the conference that was refreshingly different to any management conference I'd been to. The apparent absence of people networking was novel, as was the absence of publishers' drinks parties and people job hunting. Here I felt I could appreciate the people I met for who they were in themselves, without an eye on the position they had or held or what they had written. Okay, so here's me presenting myself as this sort of wonderfully pure academic, interested in ideas for their own sake, and wanting to escape from careers and being bothered about whether I'm going to be promoted or get more money and all that kind of thing. Even whether I publish stuff, it wasn't the thing. What I was in was this wonderful set of ideas and exploring life and so on. So, story 6. Start to reflect on this. Was this all there was to me? So this was the kind of, if you like, the Dr. Jekyll in my life, the good guy. Both Mike, this is my co-author, and I, share similar understandings of our former jobs, in the sense that we now see them as arenas in which we were often very uncomfortable with who we were. Mark still recalls the time, that's me, and he falsified health statistics to make them politically acceptable. That's another story. I can tell you about that later if you want. Mike was embarrassed to find out that the cost of his business class flight to Upper Egypt for a consultancy in technical education was more than the annual salary of the Egyptian college principal with whom he was working. So, just as Henry Jekyll stood at times aghast before the acts of Edward Hyde, the anxiety for us was that our former jobs were starting to turn us into Mr. Hyde. In other words, we were becoming the kind of people we wished we were not. In other words, doing management jobs was a kind of corrosive thing to our character. It was changing us into Mr. Hydes in ways that were uncomfortable. These experiences led us both to try to change career through pursuing master's degrees. As mature students, we peered into the work of university academics. Those students of you who are here, you ever done that, wondered what it's like to be one of the lecturers. To us, there seemed to be no hint of academics, Mr. Hydes. They appeared to deal with what was interesting. And what's more, those academics apparently worked without the complications of a desire for career progression. As Ruth puts it, they seem to have lives devoted to inquiry and education. These, in retrospect, naive observations encourage us to undertake PhDs and move eventually into academic careers. In part with the hope of becoming different people, we sought to be, as it were, something like our admired Dr. Jekylls, an escape from our Mr. Hydes. Unfortunately, things did not turn out quite this way. One of the central messages of Jekyll and Hyde is that Mr. Hyde is always a lurking presence within Dr. Jekyll. Indeed, these dual natures were, as Stevenson put it, bound together in the agonized womb of consciousness. Although we didn't realize it at the time, simply escaping one's former job would hardly... Well, I don't know what I've done there. Sorry. Simply escaping one's former job would hardly enable escape from Mr. Hyde. It wasn't, after all, just about casting off our jobs. It was about remaking ourselves within what we imagined would be a purer intellectual environment. But as Stevenson reminds us, the doom and burthen of our life is bound forever on man's shoulders. And when the attempt is made to cast it off, it but returns upon us with more unfamiliar and more awful pressure. Nevertheless, at the start of our academic careers, each of us believed, at least for a time, that we'd been able to get rid of Mr. Hyde. Just as, at one point in the novel, Jekyll reassures a friend, the moment I choose, I can be rid of Mr. Hyde. However, as we got further into our academic careers, we started to share Jekyll's later view that I was slowly losing hold of my better self and becoming slowly incorporated with my second and worse. We like to think of ourselves as people who want to write and teach in ways that reflect our moral, political and aesthetic concerns. However, we had become increasingly conscious that another, more disturbing self was simultaneously trying to pursue with skill and courage, the career game often played in academia. The anxiety at this point in our lives then was that this other self would end up only producing what Gray and Sinclair call routinized professional publication. And similarly, that this other self would teach merely to get good student evaluations. Oh, by the way, make sure you give me a good evaluation for this. It's very, very important for me. And maybe there was a twist for academics, perhaps more awful pressure, to use Stevenson's words. After all, producing work which is published in places that people read, such as in high-impact journals, is exactly the same sort of behaviour one would expect, whether, like Dr. Jekyll, one were to pursue pure knowledge, or whether, like Mr. Hyde, one wanted to get paid more. Perhaps in our old jobs, at least, differences between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde were more obvious. Okay, so having thought about that, both Mike and I ended up writing different stories about the same conference. So remember my first story about how wonderful it was to go to the conference, and it wasn't like any other management conference. Here's another story that appears later. We're on story 7 now. So this is me writing about the same thing. Why bother with this conference? This is me as Mr. Hyde rather than Dr. Jekyll, I think. Well, admittedly, it's an unconventional, somewhat scary thing to do. After all, attending it could have damaged my career in a business school, but the risks have paid off. I guess, rightly, that it could help me develop a niche to make a name for myself in organisation studies. After all, at the time of the 2005 conference, I was writing a set of critiques of evidence-based management. Oh, that's what I'm here to talk about. And criticising the evidence-based movement was a major theme of the conference. Also, very few people in business schools are doing autoethnography, performance ethnography, and other work in that kind of tradition. Things I reckon I could use to get ahead of the game in organisation studies, organisational analysis. And I did. See Learmonth 2007. So it proved useful to go to the kind of workshops that you just don't get in organisation and management to see how I can apply these ideas to my own work. The feeling at the time that this conference would be useful in career terms turned out to be right. For example, I sent Norman Denzer, the conference convener, my paper on evidence-based management. He liked it and used it in a high-profile way. He made it the white paper for the 2007 conference. Attendance at the conference also highlighted some references that I probably wouldn't have seen otherwise. References that I wrote, that ended up in a paper I wrote for Academy of Management Review, Learmonth 2006. And as everyone in business school knows, if you get a paper in AMR, then you're really cooking with gas. Oh, and why not look at Learmonth and Humphreys 2011, another paper in Academy of Management Review. The 2005 conference also gave me an opportunity to network with a small number of people from business schools who were there, 2 of whom turned out to be editors of a management journal. In fact, they asked me and Mike to write a short paper about the 2005 conference. It was a new journal, doesn't count much in the career stakes, but because it was a new journal, it tried to sell itself at the 2007 conference. So on arrival in 2007, we noticed that our paper was in the conference pack that all the delegates received. It's all about getting your name now, after all. This same networking that started in 2005 also resulted in my being invited to contribute a chapter to a book, as well as to speaking at 2 high-profile seminars, both of which are now on my CV, naturally. So can you see, I hope what I'm trying to do here is that present sort of 2 sides, 2 kinds of stories, very different stories that you can tell about ostensibly the same thing, about the same conference. One told by Mr. Hyde, that last one, and one told by Dr. Jekyll, that first one. And part of the process of writing the paper was that one started to have a realization that there were these sides to one's character. But it doesn't stop there, I'm afraid. So the third story, story 8 in the paper, was a story that goes sort of reflections of the implications of both the earlier stories. So story 8. Today we might ask more uncomfortable questions of the tales written by both our former selves than we did when we first wrote them. Don't both sets of tales suggest, for instance, that as Jekyll and as Hyde, we narrated successful identities? Successful in the sense that we've published well, and therefore as Jekyll's influenced debate, or as Hyde's climbed the promotion ladder. If so, the selves portrayed in and enacted by our Hyde tales are hardly convincing doppelgangers of the selves in the first tales. Indeed, they might both be read as similarly self-serving bragging, perhaps as aspirational narratives of identity. So we began to see other work on academic identity in new ways, especially that written from broadly feminist perspectives. For example, Harris et al. See in academic identity a rather different kind of dichotomy to ours, in other words, not Jekyll and Hyde. Theirs is a dichotomy based on polarised views about the university system of careers and rewards, a system that turns out to be profoundly gendered, where production is privileged over reproduction and output over process. Thus, for them, to say, for example, that the successful are dedicated researchers while the unsuccessful are cruisers suggests that the system is reasonable, handing out its rewards justly. Conversely, to describe the successful as single-minded writing machines, while those left behind are all-rounders who care for their students, implies that the system is flawed and unfair. But within our own accounts, there is little hint that the system may be unfair in any way. We appear to take it for granted, as both Jekyll and Hyde, that our success, in inverted commas, is what we deserve as dedicated researchers. Indeed, analyses like Harris et al.'s have prompted us to criticise both sets of our own tales in new ways, to glimpse perhaps what we now see as a more convincing Hyde-like doppelganger. That's a double. We have started to realise, for instance, that our first tales, which were initially intended to signal an identity resistant to dominant ideas about academic work, were still about research and publication. We had almost entirely neglected other, conventionally less prestigious ways of doing academic identity, such as teaching or administration. Okay, so those are how we introduce the article. Now, I want to finish by talking about something rather different. It's a paper that I published with colleagues a couple of years ago in a journal called the Academy of Management, Learning and Education. And it's about managers in Disney. Did you even realise that there were managers in Disney? There's certainly lots of work in Disney. You know who the little guy is? You've all seen Disney movies, Disney animations. This is the, I think it's the third Disney animation ever made, 1940. You know who he is? Come on, you must do. No? Pinocchio. He's the puppet who doesn't need any strings. His father. Anyway, he gets separated from his supposed father. His father, of course, is a carpenter who makes puppets. And anyway, he gets tangled up with this guy, who basically becomes his manager and wants to make money out of him, because a puppet with no strings is quite a draw for a theatre audience. So you remember the song, "I got no strings to hold me down, to make me flick and make me frown"? Okay, so he says, I'm going to make lots of money out of you, this manager of Pinocchio, and when you're too old to work, I'm going to make you into firewood. And in fact, if you think about it, I mean, most of you, I'm taking it you're familiar with Disney animations. You've seen some. Yeah? Okay. Do you know what the first one was? The first ever feature-length animation. It happens to be a Disney animation. Have a guess. Come on, I'm trying to get some audience participation here. Failing, obviously. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And can you think of work in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs? Two of the most famous songs from that. The first one was called Whistle While You Work. So that's when Snow White gets, well, the woodcutter is supposed to murder her because her stepmother doesn't like her for various reasons. But he doesn't. He hasn't got the heart to do it. And she escapes into the forest, comes across this little cottage in the woods, and when she opens the door, it's full of dirty pots and pans and things, and all needs a good tidy up. Of course it would do, because it's full of men, little men, dwarves. And of course, as we know, men don't do housework. So she, even though she's a princess, she starts clearing the place up. All the animals help her. She does all the washing up, tidies all the room and everything. And Whistle While You Work is the song that she sings while she does it. Now, the other famous song is about the men's work, Hi Ho, about going working down a mine. So men in Snow White and in all the early Disney animations clearly do very different kind of work to women, and that's portrayed systematically until really quite recently. Anyway, this is what we made of the stories in Disney's animations about work and managers. And actually, I don't know whether you've seen Oliver and Company. Admittedly, it's not one of their best movies. They had a bad period in the 80s and the late 70s to early 90s, but wasn't the classic time for Disney. But there's this film called Oliver and Company, and Oliver, who's a little kitten, I think. What kind of work do we do anyway? Tito, who's a dog. Investment banking, man, didn't you read about us in the Wall Street Journal? Really? Yeah, captains of industry. Can I be one too? We've got to clean you up and give you some on-the-job training. Here it is, you know, it's mainstream stuff about, well, in this case, presumably banking, investment banking, in what ostensibly is a children's movie. And all sorts of people are, can you think of, there's a female boss in one of my favourite Disney animations, actually. It's 101 Dalmatians. Have you seen that? And there's, do you remember the woman who's trying to get these Dalmatians and make them into fur coats? She's called Cruella de Vil. And she's really not a very nice person. If you want, I can show you some some clips from these films, but we better keep going. Anyway, if you look at the way that Disney movies, right from 1938 all the way up to certainly the early 2000s, characterize work, it's pretty straightforward. There's these structural themes, a bit like the structural themes in the hero stories that I talked about earlier. There's these structural themes in Disney movies. So the characters, almost all of them, get subjected to unpleasant work. Usually their parents either die or something happens to them that means that they're no longer with their parents, and they get put into these horrible jobs. So whether it's Snow White clearing up for the dwarves, or Pinocchio having to do this performance that he doesn't want to do, it's the same sort of theme. All the way up to the latest one that I can think of that's got a very clear representation of this is Zootopia, which you may or may not have seen. You're probably a bit old to go and see Disney movies. If you've got kids, young kids, you'll have certainly seen Zootopia. So Judy Hopps is a little bunny rabbit, and she becomes a police officer. And she's pretty clearly a female character. Judy is the clue. And they put her on parking duties because they see her as not a proper police officer. Okay, and all these people, or a lot of them, tend to have pretty horrible bosses. I mean, we counted 35 of the, I think there's 52 films that we looked at where there were these horrible bosses. So Judy Hopps, the bunny rabbit I mentioned, her boss is I think he's some kind of, I think he's a rhino or something like that. I can't remember exactly what he is. But he's clearly a very intimidating guy. And she is duly intimidated by him. But what do these people do who have been subjected to these horrible working conditions and who have got horrible managers? Well, they don't join a union or resist in some kind of way. What they tend to do is they whistle while they work. They look on the bright side. They wait for something to turn up. And then, certainly in the earlier films, they're rescued. And that's sort of the end of the film. So if you think about Snow White, at the end of the film, she's in some sort of coma, having eaten a poisoned apple, as you'll probably remember. But who comes along but the archetypal prince who rescues her, and that's it. That's the end of the film. We assume that she lives happily ever after. But what happens in the latest movies, probably from the middle of last decade, is that we get to know about their working role, so that the point about the film is that they're successful in their jobs. So we've got all sorts of characters. I mean, the best example, you know about Frozen, do you? And yeah, the princesses in Frozen, well, they're very different from earlier Disney princesses because their job is to rule the kingdom. It's not just, I mean, I don't know what princesses do. I mean, they just sort of sit around looking beautiful, I suppose, for the rest of their life. But in Frozen, their job is to run the kingdom, and it's not a very nice job. But they do it because, you know, it's an important part of their identity. So the last few animations, jobs per se, particularly for girls, become really important, and it's an important part of their identity. Okay, so we approached these Disney movies a bit like we might approach any other qualitative material, like interview transcripts or something like that. We coded them, and I won't go into in great detail the approach to coding, but it was very similar to any kind of qualitative analysis. We looked at different themes, and this is where these 5 themes and everything eventually came from. But we are quite explicit that, you know, we were 3 blokes, middle-aged, well, in my case, middle-aged. I shouldn't speak for the other 2. They are somewhat younger than me. Both of them have got young children, which is the inspiration for the paper. But I mean, clearly, we're not going to claim that what we're saying about these animations is true in some kind of absolute sense, because we're these blokes looking at films aimed primarily at children, and probably aimed primarily at girls as well, most of them. So, you know, we were, as we say, particularly aware of how our own perspectives, beliefs, values and backgrounds influence the conclusions we've drawn. Now, I think you might be, well, if I was speaking to an academic audience, you might be interested in what the reviewers had to say about this. And so what happens when you're writing an article for a journal is that you send off a first version, And if the editor likes it enough, he or she will send it out to experts in the field who will try their best to, well, no, I shouldn't. They'll be very positive about it, but they will find holes and flaws in what you've done, or they will try to. And all the reviewers, we had 3 reviewers, really pushed us on our methods. So these are some of their questions. Which author produced the codes in Appendix 2? Did all authors agree on the coding? Were the codes verified for agreement? How was this done? Etc., etc. So we had quite a hard time justifying all this. And I think one of the things I would say is that if we were writing this sort of article for a film studies journal, I don't think we'd have been asked about coding and things like that. I mean, you know, you don't code works of literature. But we tended to treat, well, we did. We treated Disney animations as if they were interview transcripts or something like that. And this is because of what the reviewers asked us to do. We produced these sorts of tables with lots of detail that I think actually is superfluous, but it was the kind of thing that an American journal asked us to do. So I think some academics who are trying to target these sorts of journals might be interested in the kind of responses we got. Okay, and this is what we think we ended up with. Getting people to read and watch Disney movies differently. We hope we've contributed a paper that provides an adrenaline shot to the docile body of the reading and watching audience. We tend to think that Disney movies are kind of innocent and, you know, they're just for fun. But when we witness a chihuahua and a kitten interacting on the streets of New York, that's the quote that I used earlier, or a fox and a bunny rabbit working together, they see it as family entertainment, of course, but also consider the assumptions around work and about organisational life that the animations are making. Okay. I've almost finished, by the way, so we've got... Now, a few final thoughts about publishing, especially these storytelling qualitative approaches. I think go for it. If you want to use a storytelling approach, then don't be half-hearted about it. Don't try and dress up what you're doing in conventional language of validity and reliability and stuff like that. I think that's kind of a mistake. I would emphasize instead things like idiosyncrasy, unique details, all this kind of thing. And I'd also avoid an impersonal writing style. I think it doesn't work if you're telling a story to use a passive voice or formal propositions or hypotheses and stuff. These militate against an effective story. So, in other words, don't be scared to say I. That's really important. I mean, I know that even today, quite a lot of people are trained to use passive voice and to avoid using the I word. I would say the opposite. And in fact, funnily enough, a lot of the journals, their guidance specifically says, use I, don't use the passive voice. Okay. Just the final thing, and then we can have a bit of a discussion. Which journals are friendly towards this sort of stuff? Well, I put up a picture of of some of the journals I published qualitative research in. I would say probably the friendliest ones tend to be European-based management journals. So I've given you a few there. US journals like Academy of Management Learning and Education, the Journal of Management Inquiry, like this sort of stuff. I'm not convinced that it's very easy at all. to get into what often people talk about the top US journals in management studies, things like Administrative Science Quarterly or Academy of Management Journal. I think things are changing. A few years ago, these journals sometimes would desk reject qualitative work simply because it's qualitative. I don't think that's the case anymore, but they do tend to hold to kind of vestigial positivistic assumptions about a lot of qualitative work. Okay, well, folks, I've talked for an hour and 20 minutes, which even for me is a lot of talking. So let me have a glug of water and see if you can think of any questions that you want to ask me. Even if it's just about Disney animations, that's fine.